What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. I am doing my fifth or sixth attempt at reviewing Fringe, a science fiction TV series that started in 2008, ended, I think, in 2013. It lasted 5 seasons. The first 4 seasons were regular length. They were about 20 or 22 episodes each, and then the 5th season was like 13 episodes long. And last year, I was spending pretty much the whole year watching and reviewing The X-Files, and about halfway through watching The X-Files, I realized that I kept complaining about the same thing over and over in each video, and I realized I could have just done one huge video and complained about everything that I hated about that show in one video instead of repeating myself 11 times throughout the year as I was reviewing that series. And I knew going into watching this show this time that there was going to be a lot of issues that I was going to have with this show, because I had watched Fringe, or at least some of the show, once before. I had watched all of Season 1 and about 10 episodes of Season 2. So I knew I was going to have some problems with this show, and I thought I don't really want to do what I did with The X-Files, where each review of each season I'm going to be complaining about the same stuff over and over again, and I'm going to make myself hoarse just repeating myself all the time. So I thought I'll just do one huge video talking about this whole show, and then I won't have to keep repeating myself. Well, the strange thing is, I actually have a lot of different stuff that I want to say about this show, so I probably should have done one review for each season, but it's way too late for that now, because if I wanted to do that now, I'd have to go back and rewatch each season, and I don't really want to do that. So here we are talking about Fringe, the complete series. This is just Season 1 on DVD. I actually watched it on Netflix, but this is for the thumbnail. We got a little nice holographic thing here, if you can see that. That's pretty cool. So talking about Fringe, all 5 seasons. So right off the bat, when this show was first coming on, I remember a lot of people saying that it was kind of like a modern-day X-Files. And having seen all of the X-Files and all of Fringe, I'm going to say that's not very true. Just on the surface, they are kind of similar. Both shows are about federal agents investigating the weird and the unusual. But with the X-Files, almost every single episode of that show treated itself like a horror movie. You might have like a bacteria that turns everybody into a small town into this big hive mind, and then Mulder and Scully go to investigate. And they would treat that like it's a horror film. The premise of it would be very horror film-ish. With the Fringe, you don't really have any episode that treats itself like a horror film. You might have some really scary stuff, and if it existed in the real world, it would be terrifying and you would never want to sleep again, but it doesn't treat it as terrifyingly as the X-Files might. And I think part of that comes down to the characters. Like, Walter Bishop is a very fun, very enjoyable character, and he is almost childlike in his love of science. He treats science like it's something very fun and exciting to look at, and it's not scary or terrifying. There are aspects of it that are scary or terrifying, but it's not a scary or terrifying thing in itself. And I think as a whole, even though this show has a lot of plot problems, and I'll talk about some of that as I go through this video, I think the big saving grace about Fringe, which is something that I cannot say about the X-Files, is that the characters are really wonderful. Sometimes the X-Files would have really fun, witty lines, but overall the characters drove me insane, and I never at any point loved the characters in the X-Files. But with Fringe, the characters are what kept me coming back. The plot sometimes made absolutely no sense because they contradicted each other, or they were just stupid in themselves and they didn't have to contradict each other because they were just dumb, but the characters themselves were still really fun and enjoyable. And I think that is why I still like Fringe, even after all the stupidity that I'm going to be talking about here in a little bit. Having said that, so I started watching the show when it first came out, and Season 1 is pretty much a whole lot of episodic standalone episodes. It tries to make the audience think that there is a big arc, and it keeps talking about the pattern. Broyle said, that means that someone out there is experimenting, only the whole world is their lab. Except that, like, 3/4 of Season 1 doesn't really have anything to do with this pattern. There's a whole lot of standalone episodes in that season that are weird mad scientists doing weird things, but they don't have anything to do with the overall arc. And that's something that around Season 2, they kind of stopped talking about the pattern, and I was okay with that, because it drove me crazy when they kept acting like everything that happened in the show was connected, when in reality a lot of it was just standalone stuff. And I'm perfectly fine with you doing standalone stuff, but if you are going to do standalone stuff, don't pretend like it's part of your overall arc of the series. Season 1 does have an arc, but it's not present in every single episode. You've got Walter Bishop. He is a mad scientist who has been in a mental institution for 17 years. And then you've got Olivia Dunham, who is an FBI agent, and her partner, it turns out, is undercover, and he's actually working with some bad people, or so she thinks. Much later in the season, she finds out he was actually even deeper undercover, and he was actually trying to root out the bad people and arrest them, so he was actually a good guy, but he doesn't really matter, so I'm not going to be talking about him very much throughout this review. And anyway, she and her partner are investigating this sci-fi terrorism plot, and then she thinks that the best way to investigate this is to get Walter Bishop, because he's a super genius. So the only way to get him out of this mental institution is to track down his son, Peter Bishop, and have his son check him out of the mental institution. So then the three of them, and Astrid Farnsworth, who kind of remains in the sidekick role throughout this whole series, unfortunately. She's a lot of fun, but she never gets anything to do in the show. The four of them, along with Olivia's boss, Philip Broyles, who is in charge of the Fringe team, they are all investigating these weird science fiction-y phenomena. And like I said, a lot of people kind of think that it's like the X-Files, but updated a little bit because it's FBI agents hunting down the weird and unusual. But like I said, the X-Files always had a spooky aura about it, whereas this show, it's a lot more sterile. It's a lot more, and I don't want to say that as a bad thing, it's a lot more like it's in a lab. Like it's very clean. It's not freaky and terrifying or scary or anything like that you might could say about the X-Files. But anyway, these characters, out of all of them, I think my favorite was maybe Walter Bishop. He is a very fun character and also played by a very great actor. I don't know the guy's name, but it's the guy who played Denethor in the Lord of the Rings movies. And John, not Bishop, John something. I'm going to look him up right now because I'm going to feel like an idiot if I... Oh man, his name isn't on here. John Noble. He's at the very end, yeah. He's the guy who played Denethor from the Lord of the Rings movies. And he plays Walter very, very great. He's probably the best actor in the show because sometimes he plays him with childlike joy, and then sometimes there's a somber sadness about his character, depending on what's going on in the scene. And he is consistently excellent in this show. But then you've also got Peter Bishop, who is a confidence man, who is kind of, sort of, didn't have a great childhood. He blames a lot of that on Walter, but at the same time, as the show progresses, he starts to care for Walter a great deal, and he's very protective of Walter, and really anybody that he's close with, he's very protective of those characters. He can be a little bit snooty's not the right word, a little bit arrogant maybe. Like I was watching the show with my mom, and she did not like Peter. I thought he was okay. I could kind of see where she was coming from, but I liked Peter. And then personally, my least favorite character was Olivia Dunham. Olivia Dunham started off in the first minute and a half of this series. She's in bed with John Scott, and she's very emotional, very happy. She feels like a human being, and I was thinking, why in the world do I remember her being so robotic and so non-emotional about everything? She felt like a Vulcan or something, like just absolutely no human emotions in this character. That was what I remembered from watching the show back when it was first airing, and then watching it this time, I was thinking, this isn't the character that I remember at all. And then her boyfriend goes into a coma, and she spends most of the season thinking that he was a traitor, and then she goes right back to being business as usual, very little smiles, very little humanity to her at all. As the series progresses, I do come to like her a lot more, and what helps is her reactions and interactions with other characters. For example, at some point in Season 1, her sister and niece come to live with her because they have nowhere else to go. And I absolutely love her interactions with those characters. They make her feel more like a human being. And unfortunately, sister and niece, they move out towards the end of Season 2, and in Season 2, they weren't even in the show that much. There was like 10 episode stretches where the sister wasn't even there at all. And then there was like one episode in Season 2 where she was in the episode, but it was an imaginary episode, so that didn't really count. So like most of Season 2, the sister wasn't even there, and then she just kind of moves out as if nothing really happened. And that was unfortunate because I felt like she made Olivia feel more like a real person, but I guess by that point, they had already gotten to a point where Olivia had grown closer to Peter Bishop. And this show does something that many, many times I talked about how I wished that the X-Files had done something like this, where Mulder and Scully start off, they don't really like each other, then they kind of become platonic friends, then they grow to respect each other as colleagues, and then eventually they become romantically involved. That was kind of the journey that I saw those two characters going on over the course of the X-Files, and of course, they didn't really do that. They just kind of snapped their fingers and suddenly they're in a relationship with each other about 7 seasons in, and it didn't feel like an ongoing journey as much as I wanted it to. In this show, they kind of do that. It doesn't feel as organic as I would have liked for it to have felt, but it feels a lot better than Mulder and Scully in the X-Files. I really liked the journey that these two characters are going on, where they start off, again, they don't really like each other because Olivia is basically blackmailing Peter so that he will stay and kind of help translate what Walter's talking about to the FBI. He doesn't really like her because he doesn't want to stay in one place, and then after a few episodes, they start to become a little bit more friendly with each other, him more so than her, and then by the middle of season 2, they start to kind of be romantically involved, sort of, and then some stuff happens, and then Peter leaves the group, then he comes back, and then throughout season 2 and season 3, I'll get to all that in a minute. It's kind of hard to talk about. So anyway, season 1, like I said, mostly a lot of standalone episodic episodes. But then there is an arc. There is Walter. He had a partner before he went into the mental institution, William Bell. And whereas Walter spent 17 years in a mental institution, William Bell kind of becomes the Bill Gates of the technology world. He builds a company called Massive Dynamic, and he was Walter's partner before they both kind of parted ways. And Massive Dynamic is kind of an ongoing source for a lot of the stories in the show. It is kind of to Fringe what the Hellmouth was to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It's kind of a source for a lot of plot points that the show can create without it feeling too contrived at any point. And William Bell is missing throughout this whole season. You don't actually know where he is until the very end of the season, but in his place is Nina Sharp, who is kind of the acting CEO. And she is a character who, she's okay. She doesn't get very much to do in this show, especially in season 1. When you're watching this show, you might be thinking that she is going to be a big part of this show. Unfortunately, no. She always kind of stays on the side. She does have more to do with the stories than, say, Astrid Farnsworth, but she doesn't get nearly as much as you might think watching the earlier episodes of season 1. But anyway, we find out that the big bad of season 1 is a guy named David Robert Jones, and he used to work for Massive Dynamic, and his big goal is to kill William Bell as revenge because he got fired from Massive Dynamic. Meanwhile, he's also started up this terrorist organization called ZFT, and for a while, Season 1 is kind of dragging us on, making us think that maybe William Bell started this terrorist organization, maybe Walter started it, because Walter has some really bad amnesia throughout this series, because as we find out later in the series, his brain was actually cut open by William Bell, and he also did a lot of drugs in his youth. So his memory is not the best, so we're thinking maybe Walter had something to do with the creation of ZFT, or maybe William Bell did. But it turns out it was David Robert Jones, and he used a typewriter that Walter had, or maybe Walter used the typewriter to create this manifesto for the future. And then ZFT is kind of built around this manifesto, and basically ZFT wants to create a new future using the weird fringe science that's behind a lot of the stuff that these guys are combating. But as near as I can tell, basically, David Robert Jones, his goals are very different from ZFT. He's just using ZFT as a big distraction so that he can go to, spoiler here, a parallel universe where William Bell is hiding. We don't know why William Bell is hiding in this parallel universe, but he is. But the Fringe team, specifically Peter, they killed David Robert Jones, and then seemingly he is never going to be a problem again. We find out that when Peter was a little boy, he was sick, like deathly sick, and almost died, and then seemingly Walter cured him. It turns out the Peter in this reality actually did die, and then Walter, he had this little TV screen that let him look into a parallel universe, and then the Walter on that side actually came up with the cure to cure his son on that side. But then there was this guy named the Observer. I'll talk about the Observers in a little bit. He distracted the Walter on that side, who they call Walternet because he's from an alternate reality. And so Walternet did not realize that he had to cure his son. So our Walter, who has already lost his son, he's like, okay, I've got the cure over here. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to cure their version of Peter so that they don't lose a son also. But then Nina Sharp, who is kind of friends with Walter in the past, she's like, no, you can't do this. I'm going to stop you. And she breaks the cure that Walter is going to take over there. So instead, Walter takes the Peter from that universe and brings him over here. And then they fall into a lake. the Observer, who distracted Walternet, he saves their lives and says, okay, you guys, I'm going to talk to you later in the future. Don't worry, I'll be back. And then Walter takes the son back to the lab to cure him, and then his wife sees the boy, and then it's like, oh, I can't take him back to the other side now because it would break my wife's heart. She's already lost her son once. We can't do it again. And then she winds up committing suicide later. But Peter, for some reason, does not actually remember being from this alternate reality. It's weird. As an adult, he has a lot, like, he says he doesn't remember stuff that Walter talks about, and once you've watched the season 1 finale and you find out that Peter is actually from an alternate reality, then it makes sense that he wouldn't remember a lot of the stuff that Walter remembers, but it does not make sense that he completely does not remember being taken from an alternate reality and having a different set of memories than a lot of the other people that he knows. But anyway, season 2 is weird because, see, season 1 ends with Olivia being told by Nina Sharp that she is going to get to go and meet William Bell, who is in this other reality where Walter kidnapped Peter Bishop. And William Bell is played by the late Leonard Nimoy. And then Olivia, she is driving to Massive Dynamics headquarters in New York City, or one of their headquarters, and then she's going up an elevator, and then the screen kind of fuzzes out for a minute, and I understood that to mean that that was the indication that she crossed over to the other universe at that point. And then she goes upstairs and she meets William Bell, and then season 2 begins some, like, 5 minutes maybe. It begins a few minutes after the end of season 1. We don't get to see the conversation that Olivia had with William Bell. We don't get to see that for a while. We will get to see it eventually in season 2, but it takes a little while. But we've got this weird thing where they're telling us that Olivia actually crossed over into the other universe in a car. And that is not true because she was in an elevator when she crossed over. And it was around this point that when I was watching this show the first time that I realized that this show was very sloppy. And if the people watching the show could actually keep up with the internal consistency of the stories better than the people writing it, then there was a huge problem. But anyway, they were trying to tell us that she was in a vehicle, a moving vehicle, when she crossed over. She didn't actually, wasn't in a moving vehicle when she crossed over, but whatever. And then she gets thrown back into this universe, and we are told that she is going to have to go back into her home universe in the same momentum that she was going whenever she crossed over, and then she's briefly in a coma, and then she comes out of the coma, and she doesn't actually remember anything that William Bell told her, but then later bits and pieces of their conversation will come back. And I still am not entirely sure why William Bell was hiding on the other side, but there are these shapeshifters who are coming over, and this is the plot for season 2 now. There are these shapeshifters, and they are working for the Walter Bishop from the other side, Walternet. And now he is a lot smarter and a lot more sinister than the Walter from our side, for 2 reasons. One, William Bell did not cut open his brain on that side because the William Bell from the other side does not exist. He died like years and years ago. And 2, Walternet, it's hinted, did not do nearly as many drugs as our Walter did. So he's got it more together than our Walter. And he also did not spend 17 years in an insane asylum. And he's actually the Secretary of the State on that side. You've got all these shapeshifters from that side. They are coming over to our side, and basically they are kind of doing these various espionage things, and their end game, I think, is to try and get revenge on the people of this side, the side that we've been keeping up with throughout season 1, because on their side, their world is falling apart. Because Walter crossed over, and Nina tried to stop him because she was telling him that there would be consequences if he crossed over this way. It would have bad consequences for their side and could destroy both worlds. It turns out it did start having bad consequences for the other side. So now they've got these breaches where a hole will open up, and it could be a huge wormhole that will suck their whole world into it. So they will have to put up these big chunks of amber to basically close off these breaches and keep their world from being sucked in. And basically, season 2 is kind of this ongoing Cold War with our side. And eventually, the people on this side, the Fringe team, they find out that there's shapeshifters that are fighting a war against them, and eventually they find out that they are from the other side, and then they go to the other side. And that's where season 2 ends. And I should go ahead and mention, like I said, Peter Bishop is from the other side. He finds out about that about halfway into season 2, and then he briefly leaves the team, and then he eventually realizes that even though Walter Bishop kidnapped him, he is still his son, basically. And then he comes back to them, and then eventually the whole team, they decide to go over to the other side for some reason. I can't remember why. Again, this is why it's really a bad idea for me to try and talk about 5 seasons of a show in one video. I really should do it season by season. But anyway, they all go to the other side, and then there's a big, huge battle with the Fringe team from that side, and then everyone seemingly goes back home, except that then we find out at the end of Season 2 that the Olivia Dunham from that side has actually switched places with the Olivia Dunham from our side. And the Olivia Dunham from our side, she is kidnapped by Walternet and kept in a prison, and then they do some experiments on her, trying to make her think that she is actually their Olivia. And then Season 3, we do something really cool. I think it's really cool, where every other episode, we alternate with one episode being set on our side with faux Olivia, the Olivia from the other side, pretending to be Olivia, spying on Walter, Astrid, and Peter and all them, and secretly feeding information back to Walternet. And then we will get an episode on the other side where we get to see stuff from Olivia's point of view, where she actually thinks that she is their Olivia, and then they're fighting Fringe cases over there, and we get to see how things are a little bit different. And where Season 2 is kind of this Cold War between these Earths, Season 3 kind of kicks that war up so that it's a little warmer. And we find out, we are being told over and over again that only one world is going to survive. And if you had asked me at the very end of Season 2, which world do I want to survive, I would say, well, obviously, I want our world to survive, the one that we've been watching for 2 seasons. But then, about halfway through Season 3, we've spent several episodes on this other world, and I'm like, well, I kind of like these guys. At first, you're thinking that they're bad guys, and that they're just trying to bring this war to the other side, but then you start to see that they're just guys. A lot of them, Agent Lee, Charlie Francis, and Olivia, they're basically just people doing their jobs. And I really like that this season wants us to feel sorry for these people, even though they are fighting a war with the people that we have been watching a show about for 2 seasons. And about halfway through Season 3, we find out that Olivia, who Peter had sex with on our side because he thought that she was Olivia, we find out that she's pregnant, and ultimately that doesn't go anywhere, and I'll explain that when I start talking about Season 4. But then when our Olivia comes back to our side, she finds out that Peter actually had sex with Olivia, who he thought was our Olivia, and that causes some tension that kind of slows down their relationship a little bit. And then end of Season 3, Peter ends up creating this bridge, this permanent bridge in between the 2 worlds, and he is telling them, okay, you guys need to work out all your stuff. We need to work together to heal both worlds. And as soon as they create this temporary sort of alliance, it's a reluctant alliance on both ends. As soon as they create this, Peter Bishop is erased from the timeline, and nobody remembers Peter Bishop. And then, Season 4, we get several episodes in what we find out is an altered timeline, where some of the stuff that happened in the previous 3 seasons happened differently now. For example, William Bell, he died, I think, in Season 2, or might have been Season 3. See, this is why, again, bad idea for me to try and talk about 5 seasons all at once. William Bell died at some point in Season 2 or Season 3. And then in Season 4, we are told that he actually died in a car crash in 1992 or something like that. And then Philip Broyles from the other side, he actually was killed by Walternet in Season 3. And then in this altered timeline in Season 4, where Peter Bishop never existed, or he died when he was a kid, rather, he existed when he was a kid. In this altered timeline where Peter died where he was a kid, Philip Broyles from the other side, he's still alive. And so we get all these minor changes, and this is where I want to talk about why I stopped watching the show about 10 episodes into Season 2. This show was extremely sloppy with a lot of stuff. The plot points, characters, ideas that they would introduce, they would just throw them into the show, and then just as soon as they would do that, they would ignore them. For example, the very first episode of this series, Peter Bishop mentions that he owes a lot of money to a gangster named Big Eddie. I think twice after that, we get references to Big Eddie. There's one guy who's following Peter at one point, and Peter kind of beats him up and says, "Stop following me." And then at the end of Season 1, 2 of Big Eddie's henchmen say, yeah, we've located Peter Bishop. Now we got to go tell Big Eddie. We never get to see Big Eddie. Also, there's one episode where Philip Broyles, Olivia's boss, he hates Olivia when he's first introduced, because he's introduced in the first episode. He hates her because she put one of his pals in jail, or she provided the evidence that put him in jail. And then later, somehow he gets out of jail, and he's kind of working over Broyles and Olivia, and he's making Olivia's job very difficult. And then by that point, Broyles is kind of on Olivia's side. You're thinking in the first episode that it's going to be this long-running feud between Broyles and Olivia, where he's gradually going to learn to accept that she is a good agent and that his friend was justly put in jail and is actually a pretty terrible person who's working with ZFT. And that doesn't really happen. Broyles, basically, it's like a light switch. First, he hates Olivia, and then suddenly he's completely 100% on her side. And then also, there's another episode where Broyles and Nina are kissing each other, and it's making you think like, oh, they have a thing going on, but then that doesn't go anywhere at all. And I'm not saying that I would have wanted to have seen a relationship between these two, because they were both pretty minor characters anyway throughout this series, but don't introduce this idea as if it's going to be a big thing and then not do anything with it. It's the whole Chekhov's gun thing. If you're going to show a gun in Act 1, it needs to be fired sometime in Act 3. Don't show us these two characters kissing if they're not going to be in a relationship throughout the rest of the show. Then you've also got, like I said, Olivia's sister and niece. They come, and at one point, sister is crying because her husband, who she's not yet divorced, is trying to fight for custody for the daughter, and we are told many times that he is a scumbag, but then we don't actually ever get to see him, and then end of season 2, she moves, and we don't ever get to see, okay, did he get custody of the daughter? Was she able to fight that off? Again, I'm not saying that I would have wanted to have seen precious screen time devoted to this, but if you're not going to follow up on the subplot, then don't even bother showing us any of it at all. You can just have Rachel, Olivia's sister, you can just have her be there, but don't devote screen time to her whining about how her husband is trying to fight for custody of their daughter if you're not going to actually follow up on that. Have Peter go and find Rachel's husband and beat him up and say, you're going to leave Rachel alone. Do something like that. But don't do it if you're not going to follow through on it. And then you've also got the whole thing that I mentioned about Olivia crossing over, and how when we saw it at the end of season 1, she was crossing over in an elevator, and then at the beginning of season 2, we're told that she crossed over in a car. And then you've got this female FBI agent who is basically, she doesn't know anything about the Fringe division, and she's investigating this weird car crash thing, and then she starts investigating the Fringe team even more, and then you're thinking, okay, she's going to be a new addition to this team. Like, she's going to be the new outsider who doesn't know anything about any of the weird stuff that's going on, and she's gradually going to come to accept it, and it's going to be second nature for her. And then you've also got, related to that female FBI agent, Charlie Francis was Olivia's best friend in season 1. He wasn't part of the Fringe team, but he was part of the FBI, and then he gets killed by one of the shapeshifters in season 2, and then the shapeshifter replaces Charlie early in season 2. And around that point, when that happened, I was thinking, okay, now that Charlie has been killed, this girl, who's not part of the Fringe team, she's going to sort of replace Charlie and become the new recurring character. She is in one more episode. That whole episode where they're making us think that she is going to be a big, important part of this series, that doesn't happen. She's in one episode where there's this creature that lives underground, or it's a human who lives underground or something, and then it comes up like a mole and kills people. She is at the crime scene, and she's writing stuff down about the Beast. And I have no idea what the Beast is, because this show never brings that character back. I don't know if there was like a salary argument or something. I don't know, but the show never brings this character back. And then you've also got the whole, what is it? Oh, I had it on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember it now. I'll get back to it. But the point is, this show would introduce a whole lot of subplots and characters and stuff like that. Yes, I do remember the one I was going to talk about. There's one episode where Olivia Dunham is kind of sort of sharing mental consciousness with William Bell, because at the end of season 2, when the Fringe team went to the other side, they meet up with William Bell, and then he's helping them go back to the other side, and then he seemingly dies. But then his consciousness actually went inside Olivia's body, and then about halfway through season 3, William Bell is actually in Olivia's body, and he is in the driver's seat, so to speak. And then they spend an entire episode with Peter and Walter going into Olivia's mind to see if they can rescue Olivia's consciousness. And at that point, most of the episode is done as a weird CGI kind of thing, and there's this guy with a big X on his shirt, and he is trying to kill Olivia, Peter, and Walter. And then after they all come out of her brain okay, except for William Bell, who apparently he dies again, after they all come out of his brain, alright, Olivia and Peter are talking, and Peter says, hey, who is that guy with the X on his shirt? And she says, oh, that's the guy who's going to kill me. And she says it very matter-of-factly, and then the episode ends. We never find out who Mr. X is. They never, ever touch up on that again. I had no idea who Mr. X was supposed to be. At one point, Walter shoots Olivia and sort of kills her, but then brings her back to life, but he can't be Mr. X because he was also in her brain, so it's some other dude, and we never find out who Mr. X is supposed to be. But anyway, throughout this series, you've got, I feel like the first 3 seasons almost are the best part of the show. Season 1 is kind of introducing us to these characters, letting us get to know them, and then it has a sort of storyline connecting to Massive Dynamic and William Bell and David Robert Jones, and then it ties all of that up, and then seasons 2 and 3 are all cause and effect, if you will. The cause being Walter goes to another universe and kidnaps Peter Bishop. The effect is now these two worlds are at war. And I feel like all of that is wrapped up by the end of season 3. Season 4 and 5 is kind of a brand new threat, and it almost feels like it's very tacked on to this very organic storyline that was building throughout the first 3 seasons. So, like I said, Peter Bishop is building this bridge between these two worlds, and then he is erased from the timeline. Nobody remembers Peter Bishop after they've formed this reluctant alliance between these two worlds. So season 4, you've got basically an altered timeline. And like I said, you had up through that point, the previous 3 seasons, you had a lot of sloppy writing where these guys would introduce subplots and then they would just completely forget that they introduced those subplots. Starting in season 4, they kind of had a reason to start changing stuff around. They would say, okay, in the previous 3 seasons, this thing happened, but now in this altered timeline, we've got a lot of other stuff that happened. For example, in season 1, there's one episode where Olivia says that every year on her birthday, her stepdad, who is basically just an evil jerk who abused her when she was a kid, every year on her birthday, he sends her a birthday card, but she doesn't know where he is. She's vows that she's going to try and find him. Well, then that's never followed up again until season 4, when somebody asks her something and she's talking about her stepdad, and then they say, well, what happened to him? And she's like, oh, I killed him. And that never happened in the previous 3 seasons. That's a new addition in this timeline where Peter Bishop died when he was a kid. Different stuff like that, like William Bell, he died at the end of season 2 in the original timeline, but in this new timeline, he died in a car crash in the early 90s. So there's a lot of stuff like that where in the previous 3 seasons it was just sloppy writing, but then in season 4 it's a new timeline. We can do whatever we want. We can contradict ourselves as much as we want because it's a brand new timeline where things are different. In this new timeline, we find out that David Robert Jones is still alive, and he is presented as being the big bad of this season, which didn't make any sense at first because his entire motivation in season 1 was getting revenge on William Bell, who in this new reality was told, we were told that he was dead. Then we find out in like the last 2 episodes of season 4 that William Bell is actually still alive, and he's trying to cure his cancer. We find out that he had cancer, and he was trying to slow it down, but that wasn't working because the cancer was still growing. And then he's also trying to create a brand new universe that's going to, I guess, wipe out our universe, and then it's going to be a home to all of these weird fringe things, like porcupine people that appeared in season 1 and then again in season 4. But you've got all these weird fringe things that William Bell is wanting to fill this new universe with, and you would think maybe William Bell would want to create a universe where he is in charge, if he is going to be doing something like that, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. His motivation here is very fuzzy. He's just kind of there to be like, hey, look, we got Leonard Nimoy back, because sometime after his character was killed off at the end of season 2, and then briefly brought back as a voice in season 3, and then killed off once again there, he, as an actor, he retired. And then they brought him back at the end of season 4, and that was kind of a big thing because he had very publicly said that he was retiring from acting. And then I still don't really understand what his motivations were throughout season 4. But while all that is going on, season 4 was kind of the point, I feel like, where the show jumped the shark. Because, as I said, at the very end of season 3, Peter Bishop is erased from the timeline. Well, then we're getting to see this new timeline where there is no Peter Bishop. Walter Bishop is basically an agoraphobe. He lives in his lab. He doesn't like going out, so he's created this earpiece that Astrid carries around, and then he talks to her from the lab while she goes out in the field with Olivia. And then Agent Lincoln Lee, who was an agent for the alternate reality in seasons 2 and 3, we get to meet the other side's version of him, our side's version of Lincoln Lee, and we briefly got to meet our version of him in one episode in season 3, but now he becomes a main character. He meets Olivia and Astrid, and then he joins the team because we don't have a Peter on this side, so we need somebody to kind of round out the cast. And this is where things get really weird, and I talk about relationships between characters. I was always rooting for Peter and Olivia to get together, until season 4, when we were told that this was a brand new timeline where Peter died when he was a little boy, and then about 5 episodes into season 4, Peter shows up. he has memories of what happened in the first 3 seasons, but then nobody else does. And so I was in season 4 rooting for Agent Lee and Olivia to get together, because Agent Lee had a huge crush on Olivia. Olivia kind of sort of liked Lee, but then when Peter showed up, then Peter was kind of trying to put the moves on Olivia. And throughout this whole season, or at least till about halfway through the season, I kept hoping that Peter was eventually going to find his way back to his own timeline. I was really hoping that that was what was going to happen, because I thought it was a very interesting idea, showing us a new timeline and then showing one character who knows everything that we know, and then everyone else doesn't know what's going on. Unfortunately, that's not the way they played it. About halfway into season 4, one of the observers, I know I haven't talked about them yet, I'll get to them. One of the observers, he tells Peter that this is your timeline, even though nobody remembers you except for you, and then Olivia starts to get the memories of the Olivia from the other timeline. This is your timeline, so you might as well just make it your home, even though nobody knows who you are. I thought that was very sloppy. I really wish that they had let Peter go back to his own timeline where everybody remembered him. But then they don't do that, and then Agent Lee, he winds up going to the other universe where the Agent Lee on that side, he recently died, and then he gets married to the Olivia on that side. So happy endings all around. And then Season 4, at the end of Season 4, we find out that Olivia is pregnant. And we had one episode that was set about 21 years in the future, I think, or maybe it was like 26 years in the future. And we find out that the universe has been invaded, or our universe has been invaded by this group of aliens who have been present throughout the whole series called Observers. Throughout the first 4 seasons, there is this group of, we find out they are scientists from very, very far into the future, and they are called Observers. They are basically the Watchers from Marvel Comics. They're bald, and they observe really important events. They are there whenever Walternate is about to cure Peter, his son, and then one of them accidentally distracts Walternate, and then the same one, he ends up saving our Walter and Peter's life whenever they almost die, and they are there through very important moments of history. Well, then we find out that they are the 12 who are actually there through seasons 1 through 4. They are actually just an advanced science team sent by their entire species, and they were not told that they were actually scouting the past to see if it was ripe to be invaded. And then a whole bunch of observers come from the future basically to invade the human race. And they are basically just really advanced humans. They don't have emotions. They've got some machinery in the back of their head that allows them to kind of map out futures and see what happens based on what happens right now. And then they're also able to move really fast. And then basically, Season 5 is set like 25 years in the future, where when Peter and Olivia's daughter was about 5 years old, the Observers, they invaded, and then their daughter got separated from them, and then the entire group, they all go into Amber for about 21 years, and then they are taken out of Amber by Peter and Olivia's daughter, who's now a grown-up Fringe agent, and then they spend the entire Season 5 fighting off the Observers, and then they have this really weird time travel idea where they're going to send this little boy who is a science project from the Observers from the future. They are going to send him back to the future to the point when humanity becomes Observers and they take away their emotions. They're going to send the boy to that point in time to show humanity, hey, you don't have to become emotionless Observers. And their plan is, if they can do this, this will completely erase the Observers from the time stream, and then everyone will get a happy ending. My problem with this is that Peter Bishop, the only reason that he exists on this side is because an observer was distracting Walternate so that Walternate did not know that he could cure Peter Bishop. If the observers are all gone, Walternate would be able to cure Peter Bishop, and then our Walter would not have gone over to that universe to kidnap Peter. And yet, in this new altered timeline where there were never any observers, Peter has a happy ending with Olivia, and they have a daughter. So that doesn't make any sense at all. But furthermore, I did not like the idea that the observers were bad guys all of a sudden. Throughout the first 4 seasons, there was no hint that they were bad guys at all. They were more neutral. And a couple of them would help our main characters, but for the most part, they were just there to observe, hence the name Observers. So it was really weird that out of nowhere, they became bad guys for the last season. And then, like I said, Season 4 doesn't really have anything to do with the main thrust of the first 3 seasons of Walter went to another universe and kidnapped a boy, and then these are the consequences of those actions. Season 4 really just feels like an extension of the series with these same characters, but it doesn't really feel like it's dealing with the same themes or even the same villains or anything like that. It almost feels like, okay, we wanted to keep going for another couple of years, so we kind of rebooted this timeline, and now these characters are dealing with a lot of the same stuff that they dealt with in earlier seasons. William Bell is back once again. David Robert Jones is back once again. So I really did not like Season 4 or Season 5 as much as I liked the first 3 seasons. But I did like the first 3 seasons quite a bit. And if you are watching this video and for some reason you've never watched Fringe before, I would recommend giving this show a shot. Like I said, Season 1 is a lot of episodic episodes, and there is a whole lot of plot problems with this show. But the characters are probably what's going to keep you coming back to this show. Personally, the characters were really fun and enjoyable. I liked most of the characters. The only one that it took me a while to get used to was Olivia Dunham, and I did come to like her quite a bit by the time you got to Season 2. I liked her quite a bit at that point. So for me, I think this show is much, much better than X-Files. I think that it's a pretty decent science fiction show. It's not perfect, definitely not perfect. I would say maybe a 6 or a 6.5 out of 10. That might sound a little harsh, but there is a lot of problems that I have with this show. Mostly, I just feel like Seasons 4 and 5 didn't really need to exist. They felt really pasted on to what felt like a very organic story that ended with Season 3. So I didn't really like Seasons 4 or 5 very much, but overall I thought this show was decent. So those are my thoughts on Fringe Seasons 1 through 5. I hope that you guys liked this review. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later in the week and next week with some other videos. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.